Hello and welcome everybody into a special edition of the PHNX Suns podcast. I'm your host, Greg Esposito, all by my lonesome today. I let my co-hosts have the afternoon off, but I wanted to bring in an old friend, a guy that I've known for a long time, Dr. Adam Annaccone. Glad to have him here. He is the clinical assistant professor, Masters of Athletic Training at the University of Texas, Arlington, also a licensed athletic trainer, corrective exercise specialist, and also spent 3 seasons as the performance and recovery specialist and assistant athletic trainer with the Phoenix Suns. Adam, how are you today?
Oh, I'm doing so well. Thank you for having me on today.
Yeah, look, Adam, when I hear about something going on when it comes to injuries or anything in that field, you're the first guy I usually think of. So I appreciate you taking the time. Obviously, last night, Suns Pelicans game 2 here in Phoenix. Unfortunately, Devin Booker having a big game winds up having to go out with a hamstring issue. Now, I know we can't talk specifics when it comes to Devin, but I wanted to understand more about hamstrings, what happens when there's an injury like this and kind of recovery. So let's start with what causes a hamstring injury in a lot of cases? What is usually the culprit as to why that area becomes a problem area for an athlete?
Yeah, so the majority of hamstring injuries occur from what we call non-contact injuries. So there's no other contact with another player, another athlete. And it typically occurs either when an athlete is running high speed or some sort of movement that is putting that hamstring on stretch. So dancers are prone to hamstring injuries because as they're bringing their leg up, their leg is straight, you're elongating that muscle. And if you go too far, that's when you can damage that tissue. So it's really any type of injury to the hamstring muscle. And it's important to note that the hamstring group is made up of 3 muscles, and not to get really technical here, but the bicep femoris, the semitendinosus, semimembranosus. So it's a group of 3 muscles, and all 3 muscles may get injured, or individual muscles may get injured when we think of a hamstring strain.
Does it tend to happen when a player is fatigued or a person, you mentioned dancers as well, a person is fatigued? Can that, does that have any impact, or is this just something that happens due to that acceleration and stopping, or what exactly is the culprit in a lot of cases?
Yeah, certainly we see a lot of injuries that take place when individuals are fatigued. But any type of insidious type of movement can cause a hamstring strain as well, or muscle strain. The way I like to think of the body is related to a car. And the muscles really have 2 actions. They have a immediate action or primary action to cause movement, right? So hamstrings will actually cause your knee to flex, but then they're also the brakes for your body as well. So as you're bringing your knee out, extending your leg, your hamstrings actually firing to slow that motion. So if you think of a car and the brakes, if you apply the brakes with a little bit of pressure, the wheels are still going to turn, right? But it slows the car down. So our muscles have 2 functions. The primary function is to cause the primary movement, but then it also is responsible for slowing our bodies down. And if an individual is fatigued, that braking system could certainly be impacted. So it's either an insidious type injury where the muscle is elongated too far past the point that it can withstand, or if they're in a fatigue state, you apply those brakes can't really handle the load and it just gives out on you.
You bring up that it's a grouping of 3 muscles. Is there a particular muscle that is more, I won't say dangerous, but worse to injure in that, or is it all kind of work in concert?
So there has been some studies that looked at the various muscles, the 3 muscles, and when they're more susceptible to being injured. I can say that the bicep femoris muscle, so it's the muscle on more of the outside part of the thigh, that muscle seems to be injured more during high speed running.
So when you look at this, what when a hamstring injury happens, is it more likely that it occurs again, or is this something that over time heals and there's no long-term effect when it comes to hamstring injuries?
Yeah. So what we do know from literature is about a third of hamstring injuries are susceptible to reoccurring or rehappening within the first 2 weeks of returning to sport after a hamstring injury. So that 2 week period is really critical, and I think that places a lot of pressure on sports medicine staffs and performance staffs to ensure that they're checking all the boxes and returning an athlete to play when they're able to return to play and not rushing the process. Because from what we've seen with literature is if it's rushed, then there's a increase in the susceptibility of re-injuring that hamstring.
So is that you bring up 2 weeks if within that frame, is that usually the timetable for healing, or is that just if you rush back within that time, a re-injury is more likely?
Yeah, so the recovery time of a strain to the hamstring is certainly variable. It depends on the severity of the injury. It depends on the individual. Each individual responds differently, and our bodies heal differently. So the recovery time is really hard to narrow down. I can tell you if it's a minor or mild type strain or injury of that hamstring, you're looking 1 to 2 weeks. If it's something more severe, then obviously you're looking a longer time frame. But that first 2 week return to play is if it's a mild injury and say the athlete is out for a week, from the time they return to sport for about 2 weeks, that's when we see the highest incident of re-injury rate.
Okay, so take me inside the room. You've been in there when you were with the Suns. What does a rehab look like on a hamstring? What kind of things can you do and are likely to be done in the case of a hamstring injury, or does it vary based on the individual athlete too much to say anything specific?
No, I think we have our certain protocols that we want to follow. And that's textbook 101 to rehabilitation process that we learned back in our education programs and what I teach our students now. So we have a protocol and kind of a guideline that's in place based on different phases of healing and how long it takes tissue to heal and things like that. But the really unique part, and as I brought up before, each individual responds differently. So it is a day by day type of process to where we are responding and we are creating and crafting the rehab program based on the feedback that the athlete is giving us and based on the feedback that we see from any diagnostic imaging or any other type of clinical assessment that we implement within our practices. We're taking all that data. We're taking the data, as I said, from the athlete. That's the biggest component, biggest feedback that we get, and we're making modifications to our rehab program based on that information, all within kind of a broader, I guess, plan of what a rehab program should look like. A comprehensive rehab program, just talking about that a little bit, will not only include focusing on promoting things to help the tissue heal, but it's looking at the entire kinetic chain. So when we talk about the kinetic chain, we know that the body works not as individual pieces, but as a sum of its whole. And so this is a prime time where we're looking at flexibility, strength, range of motion, stabilization from the toes all the way up to the head, right? So it's a good checkpoint for us to identify any type of deficits while we're also trying to promote really good healing of that hamstring tissue. So I would assume that any type of sports medicine professional out there will incorporate not only core exercises, range of motion exercises, strength exercises, stability exercises within their rehab program, but they'll also adjust those protocols based on the feedback that they're getting from the athlete.
So somebody listening probably is wondering, you say deficits when you're talking about that in terms of the athlete. I assume the deficit for somebody like myself is much different than a professional athlete. There's got to be a small window that these deficits happen. Is that true? Is it are you looking at very minor things that you try to adjust when it's a deficit with an athlete as opposed to an everyday person?
Yeah, there is some truth to that. I mean, an individual like myself who it unfortunately has resorted to a more sedentary lifestyle, grading papers and things like that. My flexibility and my ability to have fluid motion has probably decreased compared to somebody or an elite level basketball player like Devin Booker himself. So working with individuals at that level, it's more of the fine tuning of the program and looking at deficits. I mean, I'll throw out an example there. Looking at range of motion, and for someone like myself who isn't very mobile now, my flexibility and my range of motion compared to the norms for someone my age and across the spectrum may be really low. Someone like an elite level athlete, they're within the range of motion guidelines, but they may be 1 or 2 degrees off compared to their other limb. They may be 1 or 2 degrees off compared to other elite athletes out there. And so we're not talking about big deficits. It's really just honing in and fine tuning any type of strength or range of motion deficits that we're identifying and correcting those.
Final question for you. We obviously don't know the severity or any specific details about Devin Booker's injury, but can you explain the difference between a hamstring strain and a hamstring tear and what that means? Some people, I don't think, quite understand the terminology there.
Yeah, so they're one and the same. So a
Okay.
tear is actually a hamstring strain. A strain is just kind of more the medical terminology behind it. And there are three classifications of a tear or a strain. You have a grade one, which is just a pulling of the muscle fibers. A grade two is considered more of a partial tear of those fibers, and then a grade three would be a complete tear of those fibers. So tear and strain are one and the same.
Okay, so it's about those grading the severity of it more than what, and those other terms are interchangeable. Good to know. He is
Yep.
Dr. Adam Annaccone of the University of Texas at Arlington. Adam, I am so I appreciate you coming on and kind of explaining this for myself, for others. Very valuable, and I hope you and everybody on your end of things are doing well.
Greg, it was great to see you, and thanks for having me on again.